Great. Well, welcome everyone. We are about to start. So welcome to this event in the Faith Pavilion. Reckoning with Debt, the major barrier to climate action. And I will give my name is Graham Gordon. I am a head of advocacy and policy, global advocacy and policy at Christian Aid in the UK, member of the ACT Alliance and working closely with the Anglican Alliance who are coordinating this event. And I'm delighted to welcome our four speakers. I'll give more details about them before they contribute, but just to introduce, we have Athena Peralta from the World Council of Churches, and then next to her is Rabbi Yonatan Naril from the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, and then we have Dr. Zamir Iqbal, who's Vice President of Finance and the Chief Financial Officer of the Islamic Development Bank. And then we have Archbishop Julio Ernesto Murray, Archbishop of Panama, or Bishop of Panama, and working with the Anglican Communion and the World Council of Churches. So thank you all for being here. I will just give a brief introduction before handing over with various questions to our panelists. And then after a few questions, we'll have time for either question and answer or group work, depending on how things are going. But just to outline, we all know that debt is a big issue. Sovereign debt is one of the most significant barriers to climate action. And the debt statistics that we face now are staggering. The total external debt of all African countries this year is around $100 billion US, which is double what they receive in official development assistance. At least 30 countries in Africa are spending more on healthcare and education, more on debt payments than they are on healthcare and education. And we know that, or estimates are, when debt servicing becomes more than around 15% of a country's spending, then it impacts their spending on climate, on health and education, and that is the situation for over 50 countries globally. And just a personal story, I was visiting Caritas Zambia a few years ago, who provide around 50% of the healthcare and of the school services and hospital services in Zambia. And they said even in 2019, before the current debt crisis was known, even before COVID, then they were already receiving less money from the government to provide school places, to provide quality education. And this impacted particularly the poorer children who often were going to school on subsidies, and actually had a significant impact on the education of the poorest people in society. And we know that if you don't get off to a good start, it's very hard to catch up. So into this reality, when already you've decided around healthcare and education spending, then it's issues around climate finance. What do you spend on adaptation? What do you spend on resilience? And that comes lower down the list, and therefore climate spending suffers. And one of the reasons we're here today is because we know communities of faith have strong traditions and teachings on debt. They've mobilized at a huge scale via Jubilee 2000, 25 years ago. Many of you may have been part of that movement. That had significant impact in debt cancellation, particularly bilateral debt. Pope Francis has become a vocal proponent of debt relief, and we have the Catholic Church's Jubilee 2025 year coming up. And he said that affluent nations need to acknowledge the gravity of so many of their past decisions and determine to forgive the debts of countries who will never be able to repay them. It's more than a question of generosity, it's a question of justice. But the reality now is more complex. 25 years ago, it was bilateral and multilateral debt. Now we have new lenders, we have private lenders, we have new countries, we have China and other countries. So it's much more complicated. There's little consensus, but that has never been a reason for no action. So today we're going to look at the reality of how the debt crisis is impacting climate action. We're going to look at what our faith traditions, the Abrahamic faith traditions, say around that, and then move to think, what can we do together so that faith voices can actually influence and put greater action on for tackling the debt crisis that we face at the moment. So, first of all, I'm going to move over to Athena Peralta, who is, just got my notes here on the bios. So Athena is from the Philippines and is director of the Commission on Climate Change and Sustainable Development at the World Council of Churches, and is a huge expert on sustainable development, on global finance issues. So Athena, the first question to you is, just set the scene for us. Why is debt a major barrier to climate action?
Thank you so much for that question, Graham. And indeed, debt is such a big obstacle to achieving climate justice, and a huge obstacle to climate action. When you ponder on the fact that 3 billion people live in countries where, as Graham has shared, countries that are spending more on interest payments on debt than on education, than on health, and on social protection, then you know that there is something wrong with our financial system. For many countries, the burden of debt servicing means that there is barely anything left for climate mitigation, for climate adaptation, and for building resilience to climate change. I'm from the Philippines, and we are an indebted country. On average, we spend around 30% of our budget on servicing debt. And the other interesting thing about the Philippines is that we get a lot of typhoons, sometimes 20 in a year. And in the last 3 weeks alone, we've had 5 major typhoons hit the country. So there's the usual massive flooding. We have landslides. We have destruction of homes. We have destruction of farmlands, destruction of public infrastructure. And guess what? We have to borrow again just to rebuild, just to reconstruct. And we have to borrow again in order to find some way of building some resilience to climate change. There's a range of statistics, but one of them out there is indicating that up to 70% of climate finance is in loans rather than in grants. And because we are already indebted to begin with, and because we are climate vulnerable, the interest rates on our sovereign debt are higher than, say, if I was from Germany or some other country in Europe. And so because of the higher interest rates, we struggle again to repay that debt, and we fall further into debt. And then in order to pay for the debt, my country has to go into mining projects, for instance. We have to cut down our forests. We have to establish these huge plantations for cash crop exports so that we are able to earn some revenue to pay back the debt. And often this is Often this is also upon the recommendation of international financial institutions. And so this, of course, this unsustainable path, therefore further increases emissions, further aggravates climate change and its impacts. And so we borrow again to deal with it all. And because the debt is now even bigger, we have to shell out even more in debt servicing. And so it goes on and on. There is this dynamic between debt and climate change that really imposes a vicious cycle of indebtedness that, of course, really affects the poorest the most. So the burden is really on people who are living in poverty. And again, we don't have the funds to also offer social protection to them. So just between, I think, the last 3 years, nearly 172 million people fell into poverty, because debt servicing crowded out social protection. And so this is the intersection, this interaction between debt and climate change.
Great. Thanks very much, Athena, for giving us some of the stark reality of why debt is a climate issue and how that spirals the debt crisis spirals the climate crisis. We can come back to some of those issues and go into a bit more detail on some of them later or share other examples, but it's clearly, thanks for outlining that it's a moral issue just from the reality of the people that we work with as Faith for Communities on the ground. So now I'm going to move on to Rabbi Yonatan Neril, who is the founder and director of the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development based in Jerusalem, as I mentioned. He speaks internationally on faith and ecology and has co-authored the Eco Bible, that I see a copy of there, an ecological commentary on the Hebrew Bible. So, Rabbi Yonatan, tell us around what traditions and teaching does your faith offer in relation to debt? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for showing up here. As many of you are aware, the book of Leviticus in the Pentateuch, in the Hebrew Bible, mentions about the Jubilee. And in Hebrew, the word is Yovel, which means ram horn, because the Hebrew Bible talks about a cycle of 7, the sacred cycle. The week, it's not just a coincidence that the week is 7 days. We could have a 10-day week. It's because the DNA of time relates to 7. So the first 7 words, the first verse in the Bible is 7 words. And 7 times 7 equals 49. So in the Bible, there's a commandment to rest for a year on the 7th year. And then after doing 7 cycles of 7 and resting on the 49th year, then there's an additional commandment to rest on the 50th year. And that 50th year is called the Yovel, the Jubilee. It's actually one of the words in English that directly derives from Hebrew. Yovel, Jubilee, the Y becomes a J. And the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, translates Yovel as a trumpet blast of liberty. So I happen to have brought a ram's horn, which is what it's referring to. It's not referring to a metal trumpet, it's referring to a ram's horn. This is an ancient sacred instrument that the Jewish people used. And maybe I'll just blow it for a minute. Hopefully it'll work with the audio system. So the ram's horn is blown on the Jubilee year. It's also blown on the sacred days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but it's blown on the Jubilee year. And when it's blown in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, then the debt is forgiven in the society. What would our world look like if once every 50 years debt were forgiven? Everyone's debt was forgiven. How would that change our financial system? Because the crisis of debt is a crisis of justice. It's really about why is it that some people in the world have huge amounts of wealth, including the world's wealthiest person with about $200 billion in wealth, and the other, and billions of people have an equivalent amount of wealth to one person. How could that be? What type of world have we created? So part of what I want to talk about is sacred economics and why there are high interest rates on debt, and why does the Bible call to eliminate debt every 50 years? Because fundamentally, being indebted to another person is a betrayal of God, because it means that the person who's the creditor has power over the person who's borrowing the money. But the fundamental vision of the Bible is that we should be aligned, that we belong to God. God has the power. No human being should have power over us, not kings, not rulers. The power belongs to God. And so therefore, by eliminating debt every 50 years, we are returning to this fundamental religious concept that the power belongs to God. And that's an important solution to the climate crisis, to return to this understanding that this is God's world, this is God's creation, and we're only here to protect it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Yonatan, and thank you for that trumpet blast of liberty and the reminder, which is always great, that the power belongs to God, even if we see around us and it looks like other people are trying to grab that power and use it for purposes that were never intended. So moving on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Zamir Iqbal. He's Vice President of Finance, as I said, and Chief Financial Officer of the Islamic Development Bank, and is responsible for managing 35 billion balance sheet. So that's it'd be interesting to hear how that's being used. Multi-billion funding and investment programs, which has included issuing inaugural green bond in 2019, a sustainability bond of the Islamic Development Bank in 2020. Prior to joining the bank, he served as head of the World Bank Global Islamic Finance Development Center in Istanbul and the World Bank Treasury for more than 25 years. So welcome, Dr. Zamir, and please, over to you as well. Can you outline some of the traditions and teaching that your faith brings in relation to debt? Thank you.
So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, most merciful, compassionate. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to be here. I think maybe I will give you a bit of summary of what about how Islam's perspective on the debt as such. And I would maybe take this opportunity to say it's not only Islam, but in other Abrahamic religions as well. There is a certain position which is taken on not necessarily debt, but something called, which we call it a riba, which is is a interest, or in English language, sometimes it is translated as a usury. Now, although all traditions have the same kind of a word, but over a period of time, the word usury has been reinterpreted by differently. Rather than just calling it as an interest, it is being interpreted as excessive interest, and that becomes a problematic. So within the concept of, or within the tradition of Islam, all of the scholars still maintain that the prohibition is not on excessive interest, but on the interest at all, in the interest in all forms. and that actually leads to prohibition of debt. So in that sense, you can say that Islam's position is that the debt in any form is totally prohibited from. Only kind of debt is which is allowed is what we call a Qarz al-Hasan, which means a beautiful loan, which you basically give a loan to God Almighty. And that loan is only for social finance, for benevolent purposes, and with no interest as such being charged. Now, I'm trying to shorten the whole kind of philosophy of, and there's a big field of Islamic economics and Islamic finance, which has been developed quite a bit in last, I would say, 70 years. And that was actually one of the reasons why Islamic Development Bank was established back in 1975. By the way, this is our jubilee. So we have celebrated this year 50 years of our existence. And believe me, when Islamic finance or economics was introduced back in early 1970s, nobody believed that you could do finance without interest as such or without debt as such. So thank God we are still surviving 50 years and done quite a bit work in economic development of our countries. Now, people may be asking questions that if we don't do debt, how do we work, how do we finance development? Again, this is a bit more long complicated, but what the scholars in Islamic finance have advocated that what you do, that the prohibition is an outright debt. However, as long as the financing is for real economy and creation of assets, so you can link the financing with the asset, that is what is allowed. And if you technically look at it, all the financial crises in the history has been actually caused by debt or leverage. If the finance is based on financing of the real assets or the underlying real economy, you would not create a debt, you will not create a leverage, and hopefully that will not create any crisis as well. So in that sense, one of the things that we do as the Islamic Development Bank, we do only project finance. We do not do any policy lending. Unlike other multilateral development banks, which gives you a policy lending that, okay, we'll just write you a check, this is your check, do whatever you want to do. We only do a project finance, which means that we give money to build dams, roads, airports, and all of course renewable. By the way, last year we did 46% of our financing, which was about $4.5 billion. That was gone for climate financing. And this all for adaptation, but all project finance, not a debt base as such. So again, the system is not perfect, but I think we have done very well in the last 50 years doing project finance and building the infrastructure in our member countries. But I think I'll stop here because there's a lot of theoretical discussion which can take place, but I'll be happy to do that during the question and answers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Iqbal, for that perspective. And I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in Islamic finance now and the way that it's worked. And also happy Jubilee, happy anniversary. It'd be great to go later on into a bit around how some of the lending goes to some of adaptation and whether it's possible for things like loss and damage beyond some of the kind of infrastructure, because I think that's one of the big questions that people are grappling with here at COP30, COP29. I'm a year ahead of myself. And I think it's also interesting to see how usury, as you said, has been redefined. So first of all, it's on any lending, and then it's on excessive lending, and actually how it's very, very easy for us as human beings, or particularly maybe in the financial political sector, to wriggle around and see how we can make our actions fit with our faith, but actually really important to come back and remind ourselves around what the teaching is and how that is actually often a challenge to current economic thinking, as the Jubilee is as well. So I will now turn to Archbishop Julio, who is the Bishop of Panama and leading on the climate change and ecology work for the World Council of Churches. And I've been fortunate to spend some time with him this week, and I know that he's got a lot to say to us as well. So over to you, Bishop Julio.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having us here this afternoon to talk about this very important matter. I want to draw a little bit on the Jewish tradition because as you know, we as Christians draw upon the Jewish traditions in recognizing the time of Jubilee. The time of Jubilee, it's a celebration, but again, it's a time for us to realize and encourage the cancellation of debt. When we heard the mention of Pope Francis calling us to a year of Jubilee in the year 2025, he's also following in the footsteps of Pope John, who did the same, and the results were good. There were a cancellation of a sizable amount of money to the poor countries. We are hopeful that that is going to happen as well in the year 2025. But I also want to share that within the Christian community, Jesus took time to talk to people about forgiveness of the debt. And the forgiveness of the debt is under the umbrella of the meaning of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God and its values, the kingdom of God and its practices. In his manifesto, as I will call it, reading from Prophet Isaiah chapter 61, but is quoted as well in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, one of the things that is proposed and the reasons for Jesus to be among the people, among us, God among us, is for the freedom of the oppressed. That's a clear indication that there is a sense of liberation. And if we talk about Jubilee and we talk about debt, there needs to be some liberation from the sin or liberation from the charge of debt. But Jesus didn't only present that in his manifesto, but he also used parables to talk about how forgiveness is so important. And I can't go on without saying to you the parable of the man who came before the king, asking that he will forgive him the amount of money he owed him. And the king went ahead and he did that. But then when the man saw his colleague, the first thing he did was to hold him by the neck and arrest him, obligating him to pay. And other people saw that going on and they went back to the king and they said, this man that you just forgave, he didn't learn the message. He too should be forgiven and forgiving to his colleague. Or the parable of the widow that stood before the judge seeking justice, and she was insistent and persistent. And that is what I call not only insistent faith, but I call it persistent hope. It's also a way of explaining what the kingdom of God is all about. The kingdom of God is about forgiveness. The kingdom of God is about liberating. So when we listen to our Christian tradition and we get this understanding, the importance and the challenge is to make these teachings become part of our everyday living. One anthropologist would say that the history of death is a scene of profound moral confusion. Paying back money is a matter of simple morality, and anyone who has the habit of lending money is evil. So there is a confusion there. But again, the issue is really complex with many little consensus. So that's where we are today. Very little consensus, especially for an international action. two things came to mind. One, in the year 2022, when Pakistan experienced such devastating actions of a flood. They were impacted 33 million people, 40 million in economic damages, and 1,700 people lost their lives. Like Pakistan, many countries spend more money paying to the interest of the debt rather than seeking better education or seeking better health. The cost of borrowing money to pay for disaster response is also dangerous because they are the developed countries that will come and say, I will help you. And they would say, if you give me an opportunity to extract the minerals from your earth, I will make sure that you will have an opportunity to develop your country. And what we have seen is the total contrary. Development is still to happen, but what has happened is that the lifestyle of a minority group of people in other countries are living well. Something has happened in Panama during the time of the pandemic. The country, the government decided that they were going to make sure that the banks would administer millions of dollars in loans so that people would be able to recover from what had happened in the pandemic. And here is where the word corruption comes into play, because the banks didn't use the money to offer low interest. What they did is offer the interest that they wanted to have, but they also offered that in a short period of time you had to pay back whatever you got as a loan. There were no supervision on the part of the government in terms of what the banks were doing. And the banks became richer and richer, and the poor became poorer and poorer. So for us, as we look at the tradition, our Christian tradition teaches us that it's a matter of liberation, a matter of forgiveness, but the world in which we live sees as investment and gaining interest on capital. There is a lot of work that needs to happen, but I will stop for now and give you some more later.
Great. Thank you very much, Archbishop, for that reflection. And I think it's just a reminder, I think, of some of the teaching we have also of structural sin that comes into our system, where actually institutions have a power beyond the people working within them. And actually, sometimes we need to think of different action where you may have a whole load of people who are really well-intentioned, but actually the impacts go in the exact opposite way of what we want. So I'm going to ask you all a quick fire question where you won't be able to present all of your manifesto for how to reform the global financial system. But I'm just going to tailor a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions and discussion with the audience. So Rabbi Yonatan, I'm going to start with you. I was struck by the fact that you said the current system is a betrayal of God when a creditor has power over another human being. And we see the situation where creditors have power over countries. What can we do to, if we're looking at international policies or norms or ways of working, give us a couple of thoughts around how can we start thinking about that differently? What can we start to do as faith groups to address that?
Well, I think that faith institutions and faith leaders have an important role to play in helping to set the conversation in regards to what are humanity's expectations at this current time. The climate crisis derives from the reality that the operating system of humanity is based on desire for endless growth, and it's based on greed. And we need to change the operating system. So the expectations in terms of profit margins and GDP growth and the amount that banks, as Archbishop Julio was talking about, how much the profit that banks will have. The current system has maximized profit, but faith leaders and faith communities and the millions of clergy around the world should help reorient humanity so that we don't have this expectation anymore of living a constantly increasing material standard of living, because the earth is showing us that it's not working. The earth is buckling under the weight of billions of people seeking a high consumption lifestyle. And so debt is one symptom of that. It's a symptom of essentially our trying to squeeze as much as we can, from the earth. That's the extractive economy. And debt is a symptom of essentially squeezing as much as we want from the countries that some countries have power over other countries. And so, but it derives from the same spiritual root, which is greed. And that's where faith communities come in to help us to reorient from a mentality, from a worldview, from an operating system that is focused on greed and pleasure satisfaction and instant self-gratification to one that is focused on spiritual growth and family and community and service to God.
Thank you. And that, I think it reminds me of one of my favorite Psalms, where it talks about speaking to God and saying, don't give me too much that I will forget you, or too little that I will resent you. And it's around, I think, a theology of sufficiency, and actually, which is, we do need something in counter to this greed. So we'll come back to that, think about questions for that, or what does that look like in the kind of realpolitik of the global system now. I'll come to you, Dr. Iqbal, next. Now, you have huge experience in the World Bank and now in the Islamic Development Bank. The World Bank has a different operating model. There's a lot of policy lending, there's a lot of conditions, there's a lot of, we know in the past, structural adjustment that has actually reduced spending on essential goods in place of lending. What do you think in the current global system? What can the World Bank learn from the way Islamic finance is being operated, and from your experience in the Islamic Development Bank around how do you change a global system on some of the principles that you're operating on?
Well, thank you so much. I think it's a very loaded question, and I would not speak anything on the behalf of the World Bank. But being the fact that when I was there, World Bank was and still is interested in learning more about Islamic finance. So that shows that they do see merit in the system. I think, debt has existed for centuries. So you cannot just replace that system overnight. So it takes, and it is a big, long history, by the way, on the debt. I think coming back to your question, one thing is, as you know, Islamic finance offers that debt is replaced by either an asset-based finance or a risk-sharing finance. Okay. Now, what gives me more optimism that we live in a world where the financial engineering has matured, and you can go and structure anything which you want given a financial system. So, which means that you don't have to have a purely debt-based financial system. You can develop a system which is based on more asset-based and more risk-sharing, okay? And we have all seen what kind of issues, derivatives and all these other things have brought to our financial system. So I think we are moving towards more maturity of the financial system, where there's better appreciation of these kind of I would say, instruments which are not necessarily all debt-like or debt-based. So that's one thing. However, the challenges are that the mindset. If you look at the investor mindset is very risk-averse. They would not like to take a risk. However, there's a plenty of examples where the PPP, which is more like a project development and public-private partnership, and there's a less component of debt but more component of risk sharing or risk taking, that has resulted into a development of many kind of infrastructure projects in the world. Okay, so I think as we mature, we do see there will be more appreciation of these different things. Now, World Bank is already trying to bring private sector into it, but coming back, it is the investor mindset. Investor mindset is risk averse, doesn't want to take risk, says that, okay, just I'm happy to take X percentage of fixed interest rather than putting my skin in the game and learning to do the projects myself, taking little bit risk and not rely on the debt. So I'm hoping that as the financial systems in the developing countries get more mature, some of these instruments which, I mean, we have been doing instruments which is based on either leasing or as a developing the infrastructure or other risk sharing, those could become much more recognition at an international financial system level, and maybe there will be a gradual transition out of that, I hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Some great thoughts there. There'll be more. I've got a question, but I'll follow it up later if there's time. So coming to you, Athena, we will. Sorry, Bishop Hule, I'm going to leave you last in both rounds. I'm really sorry about that, but last will be you get some good words to say. So, Athena, we have lots of spaces globally where we discuss debt. We have the G20, we have the World Bank, we have the Financing for Development conference coming up next year. Give us a sense of, from WCC and from the faith actors and others you're working with, where do you want to see change? Where do you think there's the most hope, where we'll get real action on debt, which will lead to greater climate action over the next couple of years?
Thank you so much for that question. And I do think we have to be in all of these spaces, from the G20 to the IMF and World Bank meetings. But having said that, in June of 2025, we do have an unprecedented opportunity to really, reshape the way our international financial architecture is shaped. We have an international conference on financing for development that is coming up. And the last time there was a Financing for Development conference was 10 years ago in Addis Ababa. And this was coming, the Addis Ababa FFD conference, came, a few years after the global financial crash. And so it was really also a moment to rethink how we run our financial and economic systems. But I think we are again at this point because precisely of that relationship, this intersection of the climate emergency and the debt crisis. We are again at a moment where we have to come together as governments and really rethink what are we going to do about the debt crisis, and how can we address the debt crisis and the climate crisis together, because you can't have climate justice without debt justice. And so as faith communities, as civil society, it would be critical for us to be at the International Conference on Financing for Development in Seville. And there are new proposals that are coming out to tackle this intertwined crisis. And I think these are the spaces where we have to raise some of these new proposals. We have had a lot of traction on a UN tax convention. And as faith communities and as civil society, we are now thinking we also need a UN convention on debt. I think I will leave it here for now. Perhaps if there's more questions around that. But we really need to be following the Financing for Development conference in Seville.
Great, thank you. And then Archbishop Julio, just over to you. As faith communities, how do we get our voices heard so that we're not necessarily just another actor, but actually changing? How do we change the debate, change the narrative? Because I think, as we spoke about, it's an issue of hearts and minds. It's about moving from the technically possible to the morally necessary, and the stretching the kind of political imagination. How do we do that? Whether it's looking up to the financing for development or in climate spaces, give us some of your thoughts on how we as faith actors can get our voices heard and change the debate.
As a faith actor coming from a Christian background, the concept and the practice of the kingdom of God says that I need to be interested in making sure that everyone has enough to live on. So it goes from greed to having enough for life. As a Christian background, again, it's a matter of justice, meaning that we look at the most vulnerable, we look at the poor, and those who have more, to make sure that those who have less would also be able to have what they need for life. So it's the concept of the kingdom of God that really is going to be at the heart of every decision that is made, making sure that everyone has enough for life. And here we go back to listening to the indigenous groups, Kamakasai, Buen Vivir, making sure that everybody has enough for life. So both spiritualities, Christian and indigenous groups, share that same spirituality. But here again, because of the reality that we live in terms of having to face the challenges of climate change, how important it is for us to recognize that there is an ecological debt as well that we need to address. And what we see again is the issue of having to move not only in terms of development, but move in terms of the environmental care that we need to have for the environment. And I'm not talking only about the earth, but I'm talking also about the water. Not only Pachamama, but also Moana. As faith-based organizations, as we look at the ecological depth, we are calling the attention of how important it is for us to take care of the environment and ask insistently, because of our faith and because of our hope, that we can reimagine what a financial architecture can look like in a way when we move from the capital generation to focus on public resources on sustainable outcome. Yes, as a faith-based organization leader, I will also ask for us to consider the debt cancellation. I will also look in terms of change the system of how debt is handled make sure that we're responding to the reality? And how would it be if on the boards where decisions are made, like the World Bank or IMF or others, that you will also have representation coming from developing countries? And I would leave it up to there for now.
Great, thank you very much. So that's last one, a challenge to reimagine the global financial architecture in 20 minutes. So I'm sure it's, but I think also a call to much more democratic participation in these processes and the question around whose voices are heard, which is always the case in whatever level we have of decision making, and it's still a struggle to get the right voices heard, often those who are most affected, who are least able to participate. So over to you. We have we'll take kind of 3 or 4 questions. I think, have we got a roving mic somewhere? So 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Martha. The gentleman here first, and then gentleman in the middle, and then at the back.
Thank the organizers, the Faith Pavilion, and I thank the panelists. So I came in because I'm interested in the issue of debt when we're dealing with accessing funds for climate change. And I want to say that I think that the faith community has a huge responsibility, not only in helping to call for debt cancellation, debt restructuring, so that continents like Africa can free more resources to deal with the realities of climate change. But we also have a bigger responsibility of ensuring climate accountability, especially even from those who hold the debts. We know that a lot of debt, a lot of funding that has gone into debts in Africa, for instance, didn't achieve the objectives they were set for. So it's been double jeopardy. The people hold the money and they never even benefited from it. So the conversation should be expanded a bit to also look at accountability at all levels. Those who are bringing in monies in terms of debt, in terms of investment, in terms of loans, and those who are also receiving, there needs to be accountability, because at the end of the day, it's the people, the average persons who are vulnerable, who carry the burden of these debts. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just ask you to introduce yourself first? Sorry,
sorry,
and then before you pass it on.
My name is Sulaiman. I live in Lagos, Nigeria. I work with Eda Resource Center and I work with smallholder farmers.
Great, thank you. So if the next questioner could introduce yourself as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kamar Iqbal here. I'm working with the Pak Mission Society. We are a faith-based organization from Pakistan. So we are constantly following up loss and damage fund. So my question is related to that, like discussions are going around the loss and damage. And again, we are listening again and again that the loans will be given under that financial instrument. Modalities, frameworks that are being under discussion. So how the faith actors, they are playing their role as a collective effort to make it more, grant-based rather than the loans-based. And secondly, how we can ensure the inclusion of faith actors, like being the frontliners, providing the services to the communities at the grassroots level, their inclusion not only at the implementation but at the planning level. Starting from the planning to the implementation level, how we are ensuring their space at the table, at those tables where these discussions and frameworks are being derived and formulated, and then how it will be more inclusive, equitable, and just for everyone. Thank you.
Hello, Linnea Main from the Episcopal Church. Thank you. I learned so much from this panel. I wanted to sort of flip the questioning a little bit. We've been talking about the viewpoint primarily of the lenders themselves. What would you as faith leaders say to the individuals, the communities, the countries that are asking for debt? How does that relate when it's not a question of greed but need? If we reduce debt and the idea of debt, what will replace it to meet the needs of those who are in need?
Great, thank you. Is there one more question before we come back to the panelists? Yes, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Graham, and the panelists. I think there's some symbolism.
Introduce yourself first.
Sorry. So my name is Adrian Chikore. I'm with Christian Aid. I'm based in Harare in Zimbabwe. So basically there is some symbolism in what you've just said. There is a lot of, or there are cries within the negotiating rooms from those who seem or deem themselves oppressed, right? And they are basically calling for grant-based finance, public finance, and probably in the discourses around NCQG and loss and damage. However, on the flip side, the powers that be in the Western Bloc are basically pushing for those debt-creating instruments as part of the quantum, amongst other things. So my question is, how do we then use our prophetic voice to have ourselves heard within the negotiations, the avenues we're trying to, engage in to ensure that a number of proposals that are coming from groups such as the G77, the Arab group, amongst others, are heard with regards to a progressive NCQG as well as loss and damage financing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So just be thinking about those questions. So we have questions on how do we get accountability at all levels, not just globally but nationally, around how do we deal with the kind of loss and damage fund when a lot is becoming through loans. What do we say to countries who are asking for more money and debt based on needs, not on greed? What do we say to Western governments who are kind of keen to push through more loans? And maybe I'll throw one in from here, is that a lot of the negotiations we've seen here, the dynamics have been a call for public finance, and then the response is we don't have enough public finance in terms of aid. And then for the response is, well, it's all got to be private finance. I'd be interested to know, where do other forms of finance, like taxation on polluting industries, high wealth individuals, or unproductive financial transactions, where do you think that comes into in terms of politically feasible solutions? So, Archbishop Julio, can I ask you to go first, pick whichever one you'd like to come in on, and then maybe we can pass the microphone down the row. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try loss and damage. The understanding is that loss and damage should not be in the form of loans, but should be in the form of grants. But for the grants to be offered, you also need to look at the process that you need to go through in order to access the funding. The second thing about loss and damage is that it cannot be on a voluntary basis. Everybody needs to make sure that they have made a contribution into loss and damage. Because if it's voluntarily, then some might say, yes, I want to put in, and others would say, well, I'm not obligated to do it. But loss and damage is so vital, just as mitigation and adaptation funding. I said in a previous panel the fact that when the Paris Agreement was signed, mitigation and adaptation was taken into place. And finally, thanks be to God and to the work that was done, as we gathered in Sharm el-Sheikh, loss and damage became a reality. But we're hoping that it's not only the loss and damage of structure, but also the loss and damage of the integrity of life. Because there are many things that are not loss and damage economically. So we're hoping that that is also taken care of in the whole process. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I don't have much knowledge, information about the loss and damage funds. I won't say anything. I think I just want to make a general comment that I think there's a need that the faith-based community need to come together and talk about an alternative financial system. And I think if they go back to their everyone's roots of their faith, they will realize that maybe that itself should be stopped before it become a problem. So we need to look at kind of collectively on that. And we have, as I said, a bit advantage that we have been trying to practice this, introduce to the rest of the world. Although, again, it has been a struggle, it's challenging, because when the whole financial system is all developed in a certain way, it's difficult to change, difficult to introduce new things. So rather than countering a problem down the road, I think things should be fixed up front, and we should try to see there are alternative ways of financing development, alternative ways of going into sustainable development, which is not only sustainable, resilient, and as well as good and moral and ethical. So we need to look at from a much bigger perspective, and we need to work together to make sure that for the sake of humanity, we are all working for their own, everyone's goodness, rather than having a problem down the road. I think the other question your question was about the private finance or so. I think here maybe I'll say that within Islamic finance, we have a small kind of you can say, small segment which is known as Islamic social finance, which basically try to bring this, zero cost or maybe these low cost pure loans, Qarde Hasan, or the whole issue of zakat, which is the, basically a certain tax which are purely done for the social safety nets and all these benevolent things. And then we have other instruments which are used to create or attract philanthropic funds and making them in a more, organized way, how to channel them for development. So there's a lot of work has been done. And I do urge all the faiths together to at least look at these different ideas and see how some of these ideas may work, some of these ideas may not be able to scale up, but we need to all work together to make sure that how do we take all the good ideas and move forward for the development of at least in our member countries. Just to give you statistics, 32 of 57 member countries in our member countries are fragile countries, conflict countries, and that kind of makes our challenges much more bigger. But we need to work together to combat these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. So I'd like to relate to Reverend Linnea Main's question of the Episcopal Church about the demand for debt. And this question about which relates to living beyond our means, which is a sickness that pervades society. There's a Chinese proverb, a person is not sick because they have an illness. A person has an illness because they are sick. Which I understand to mean that there's something deeper going on. And so part of the mentality is this mentality of wanting more than we can have. It's like being at a buffet. I just wanted to see, I keep kosher, so I couldn't really eat at the food court, but I wanted to see what was in the food court here. So I looked at the food court, I saw there was a buffet, and I also saw that most of the food had meat in it, which surprises me at a climate conference, given the contribution of meat. Anyway, that's for another session. So there's this aspect of national debt, which I think is what we focused on, but there's also the aspect of personal debt. The credit card fuels overconsumption, which fuels climate change. And so that's another aspect. And there's all these advertisements for getting a new credit card and of personal debt, and many people in the world having large personal debt. The previous session here at the Faith Pavilion focused on climate financing and faith-based institutions, which is a related topic. And because faith institutions, actually religious philanthropy is the largest segment of philanthropy in the United States. And But what about a moratorium on new houses of worship that are fancy? Let's wait to have a sustainable planet until we build new fancy houses of worship. How about a moratorium in terms of, because I'm talking now about how do faith communities deploy their wealth and their resources, because 85% of people on earth affiliate with a religion, and there's tremendous wealth within faith communities. How about a moratorium on missionary activities? What if religious institutions pause proselytization until we ensure that the next generation inherits a thriving and sustainable planet? So in relation to what you were saying, the current financial system is a key driver of the climate crisis. And so we need to change the financial system so that it's underpinned by faith values. And that's why we need sacred economics, a holy way of transacting and doing business that uplifts people and planet for the good of God.
Thank you. And finally to Athena.
Thank you, and I will try to address some of the questions around loss and damage and the NCQJ. And I think we all know that really the most contentious item that is being debated right here at COP29 now has to do with money. And we as faith communities, together with civil society, we have been calling for a loss and damage fund for climate finance that is based on need, that is at the scale required, that is in grants instead of loans. And we know, the studies are telling us that this amount that we need to respond to the climate crisis is going to be in the trillions. And so the question is, and this is what the governments are also telling us, there's no money. Okay, we can put in maybe 18 million here, 18 million, when we need to raise trillions of dollars. And so the core question really is, how do we raise trillions of dollars? And I think there is a way. The money is there, and I think as faith communities, we also have to, as part of our advocacy work, really underline that the money is there, and we just need to look at alternative ways of raising the funds, not least through taxation. Wealth taxes, for instance. We could also have progressive carbon and pollution taxes. We could have a financial transaction tax. All of these taxes on the wealthiest polluters who are, as we know, responsible for the climate crisis. And again, we have studies showing that all of these tax measures can, raise at least, half of the cost of tackling climate change. But then again, that's still not enough. Debt cancellation still has to be part of our asks, again, to free up the resources to tackle the climate emergency. Fossil fuel subsidies, my God, eliminate those. I don't understand why some governments are still offering fossil fuel subsidies, and that has to stop. The other thing that we have to tackle, military spending. Again, we have a climate emergency. Why are we directing resources, into war and destruction when we need to be investing in our communities, in our only planetary home, and in the future of our children. So I guess the message is the money is there. We need to make the wealthiest polluters pay.
Thank you very much. A rallying call at the end to... Oh, go on. Sorry, Bishop Julio. Do you want to pass the microphone down?
The last will be the first. I want to add to what Athena has said, but in a different way. We need to address the matter of corruption in our governments. And I'm talking about the region that I represent, which is Latin America. And the way of doing that is making sure that as a faith leader, the use of our prophetic voice need to be heard. Now, what does this prophetic voice mean? It means that if you're going to speak to government, if you're going to speak to power, you need to make sure that you have the facts of the truth. You have to be well informed. But you know that in our case, it's not only speaking to the governments, because as faith-based organizations, we have taught leaders how to do that. We need to go even further and talk to the owners of the corporations that are polluting the most. I can't ask my government to do that because those companies have already greased the palm, as we say in Panama, greased the palm of some religious leaders and their communities. So I can't ask the government to go ahead and do that conversation. I need to be careful what I'm saying, because again, in some of our countries, some of the leadership in the churches want to be close to government because they want to get advantage and they want to get, the help that otherwise is not going to be there. The Panamanian Constitution says that there will be no privileges. Unfortunately, we have seen many privileges in going into one direction of one religious group. And that needs to stop. So our prophetic voice needs to be ready to stand on the line or stand up, but with the facts. If there is a need that the government needs to address, it needs to address it in a way that there is a common good for all, not for just a minority. The rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer. And I think as faith-based organizations, we need to raise our voice and do more in terms of speaking not only to government, but also speaking to the owners or corporation that are polluting the most. Thank you.
Thank you. So I won't, we've come to time. I'm not going to try and sum up the rich discussion we've had, but maybe just a kind of final thought, and it goes back to one of my kind of favorite theologians, Walter Brueggemann, who talks about the prophetic imagination. And I think in a biblical tradition, through our faiths, the prophets have always been those who've shown what is wrong, but who've also brought hope to bring around a new reality. And I think some of the discussions we've had today, which have been very rich, around theologies of having enough to live, a kind of an approach of the kingdom of God, but in other Jubilee traditions as well, of thinking of new models of finance that come both from within religious traditions, but also as we're challenging the global structure, to learn from and to try. And then just calling out some of the just the horrific inconsistencies in our global system, like fossil fuel subsidies, which amount to roughly the same amount as we're calling for in terms of $1 trillion for climate finance, that just skew the economy towards a destructive approach. So it just remains for me to thank Archbishop Julio Dr. Iqbal, Rabbi Jonathan and Athena for their contribution, and thank you all for coming for what has been a really rich and inspiring debate, and I hope for ongoing collaboration between faiths as we try and bring about the kind of world that we know that God wants and He's called us to bring about. So please share with me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you for sharing about Islamic finance. I'm absolutely